Is it a sin to ignore climate change? Let's talk about theology of the earth versus end times apathy. This provocative question is no longer just a hypothetical debate meant for the fringes of eco-blogs or progressive seminary classrooms. As wildfires turn skies orange and historic floods swallow communities whole, the intersection of faith and the environment is commanding center stage. The sanctuary and the ecosystem are colliding, forcing believers to answer uncomfortable questions about their role in the unfolding climate crisis. Consequently, creation care has transitioned from a niche, often dismissed topic to a central theological battlefield. The lines are drawn not just by political affiliation, but by deeply ingrained interpretations of sacred texts. At the heart of this conflict is a profound debate. Is climate change merely a predicted sign of the end times, a fatalistic green light to ignore the crisis? Or does the human race have a divine mandate for stewardship, making environmental destruction a direct affront to the Creator? The mandate of stewardship. To understand this battlefield, one must return to the foundational texts of the Abrahamic faiths. In the book of Genesis, humanity is placed in the Garden of Eden to work it and keep it. For centuries, the theological emphasis was placed heavily on the concept of dominion, a word that, particularly during the Industrial Revolution, was disastrously weaponized to mean domination, extraction, and unchecked consumption. The earth was viewed as a limitless reservoir of resources granted to humanity for economic progress. However, modern eco-theologians argue that this interpretation is not just a mistranslation, but a profound theological error. Dominion, in the context of a benevolent creator, does not mean tyranny. It implies the loving, protective rule of a steward entrusted with the king's estate. The earth does not belong to humanity. It belongs to God. Therefore, how humans treat the earth is a direct reflection of their respect for its maker. This is the genesis of the creation care movement. It positions environmentalism not as a secular, politically liberal agenda, but as a conservative, orthodox obedience to God's first command. To care for the creation is an act of worship. Conversely, to defile the waters, strip mine the mountains, and pollute the air is not just bad policy, it is a desecration of the sacred. The paralysis of end times apathy. Opposing this view is a powerful, deeply entrenched theological perspective rooted in escapist eschatology. For many believers, particularly within certain evangelical traditions, natural disasters, famines, and changing climates are not calls to action, but rather fulfilled prophecies. They are viewed as the birth pains, signaling the imminent return of Christ and the end of the world. This apocalyptic worldview breeds a dangerous phenomenon: end times apathy. The logic is tragically simple. If the earth is ultimately destined to be destroyed and replaced by a new heaven and a new earth, why bother saving it? Polishing the brass on a sinking ship seems like a fool's errand. This fatalistic theology suggests that worrying about carbon emissions or sustainable energy is at best a distraction from saving souls, and at worst, a lack of faith in God's sovereign timeline. The practical fallout of this apathy is immense. It provides a theological alibi for ecological negligence. Furthermore, this passive theology often aligns seamlessly with the interests of fossil fuel corporations and industries that profit from deregulation. When believers are convinced that environmental destruction is divinely ordained, they become the unwitting foot soldiers of industrial greed, voting against environmental protections under the guise of religious conviction. The rise of eco-sins. This clash of worldviews brings us to the most controversial and paradigm-shifting angle of the modern environmental debate: the concept of the eco-sin. Traditional theology has largely defined sin in personal, interpersonal, or sexual terms. But as the consequences of climate change become impossible to ignore, a new moral framework is emerging. If destroying God's handiwork is a rejection of God's will, then systemic environmental degradation must be recognized as inherently sinful. The uncomfortable question must be asked: if you believe God created the earth, how can you systematically support industries that destroy it? For decades, believers have boycotted companies for moral or social stances that conflict with their values. Yet there remains a glaring cognitive dissonance when those same believers invest in, work for, and defend corporations that poison the very earth God pronounced good. Acknowledging eco-sins challenges the modern believer to reconcile their Sunday worship with their Monday consumption. It forces a moral audit of one's carbon footprint, dietary choices, and political votes. To brush off climate change as a hoax or an inevitable apocalypse, while actively participating in the hyper-consumerism that drives it, is, under this emerging theological lens, a form of spiritual rebellion. So, is environmentalism the new Ten Commandments? While it may not replace the biblical tablets, the moral weight of ecological stewardship is quickly becoming just as foundational. Thou shalt not steal takes on new meaning when a generation steals a habitable climate from its grandchildren. Thou shalt not kill is violated when millions die from air pollution, resource wars, and climate-induced famine. The human cost, loving thy neighbor. This brings the theological debate out of the abstract and into the deeply human. Climate change does not impact humanity equally. It disproportionately devastates the poor, the marginalized, and the global south, those who have contributed the least to greenhouse gas emissions. Rising sea levels swallow impoverished coastal communities, and extreme droughts starve subsistence farmers. Therefore, ignoring climate change is a direct violation of the second greatest commandment: love thy neighbor as thyself. The theology of the earth is inextricably linked to the theology of justice. One cannot claim to love their neighbor while driving the engine that floods their home or dries up their well. In this light, climate apathy is not merely a theological blind spot. It is an act of systemic violence against the vulnerable, reclaiming the sacred. The theological battlefield over climate change is ultimately a fight for the soul of modern faith. Believers are being called to reject the paralyzing grip of end-times apathy and reclaim a robust, active theology of stewardship. The earth is not a disposable waiting room for the afterlife. It is a breathtaking masterpiece entrusted to human care. Treating the climate crisis with the moral urgency it demands is the great spiritual test of our time. Acknowledging our eco-sins is the first step toward repentance and restoration. Ultimately, protecting the earth is not a secular distraction from faith. It is the profound realization that honoring the Creator requires fiercely protecting the creation.